Welcome back. She was a young Muslim woman standing up for her right to free expression, whose murder has caused outrage throughout the Arab and Muslim world. But this is not the iconic Neda, whose dying moments during a Tehran street protest in June were broadcast on televisions and computer screens the world over. 10 days after that, 32-year-old Marwa El-Sherbini, a pregnant Egyptian pharmacist living in Germany, was stabbed to death in a court of law by the man who she was having prosecuted for making racist slurs against her. Haven't heard about the case? That's the point. The murder of Marwa El-Sherbini received all kinds of coverage in the Arabic and Muslim media, but limited and mostly tepid coverage in Western media. The Listening Post's Salah Qadar now on the murder of two Muslim women and why it might be that only one of them has been turned into a martyr by the Western news media.
Few people are likely to forget her face or her name.
Hearing more about the woman who's become something of a symbol of this uprising.
Nida Sultani, muhalif hareketinin simgesi halinde.
The image of Neda Sultan's last moments on the streets of Tehran caught the attention of audiences around the world as her story dominated global news reports.
Neda. Her name is Neda.
And many are calling Neda the angel of Iran.
Yet less than 2 weeks after the media storm surrounding Neda's death, a pregnant young Egyptian woman, Marwa El-Sherbini, was ruthlessly murdered inside a German courtroom.
Now, the murder of a young Egyptian mother inside a courtroom in Germany last week has sparked angry protests in the Middle East. Marwa El-Sherbini was stabbed 18 times by a man on trial for racially abusing her.
While Neda's death has become emblematic of so much, Marwa's tragic fate went almost unnoticed in the Western media.
If a cat or a dog had been stabbed in the way that Marwa was stabbed, I think they would have probably got more coverage in the media. You've got Marwa being killed in a German courtroom where she's taken her murderer to court because he had been abusing her, threatening her, and despite that, there's been very little in the media which says, hang on a second, that there is a rise of anti-Muslim feeling within Europe and this needs to be tackled.
I was speaking to a colleague of mine who's a reporter for a very prominent network in the United States about the killing of Marwa El-Sherbini in Germany. He had no clue of what I was talking about. On the other hand, he was very familiar with the murder of Neda Sultan in Iran. After all, his network provided wall-to-wall coverage of the recent election controversy.
So was the story of Marwa's horrific end in that Dresden courtroom simply missed by so much of the media, or was it ignored?
It surprised me, actually, that given that the facts were so clear in the Marwa case, that there wasn't a greater discussion of the way in which Islam has been constructed post 9/11. There's a tendency for the media in most European countries to represent Muslims as being the aggressors and as being the perpetrators of violence. And when in fact Muslims are the victims of either hate crimes or racism, there isn't a natural language to be able to express that within the European media.
Yet compare the coverage of Marwa to the killing 5 years ago of a filmmaker in Holland, when a Muslim was the murderer and not the victim.
Now, many commentators cited the massive coverage on European networks of the murder of Theo van Gogh by a Muslim extremist in 2004 as an example of the unequal value attached to the lives of Muslims and non-Muslims in Europe.
These incidents are a symptom of the climate that actually exists. When you say, okay, why aren't they being reported? I mean, that's a question that needs to be addressed to those media outlets themselves, that they're happy to talk about Van Gogh and the movement that has been created within society.
It's a very sad indictment on the attitude of the Western media.
The coverage of Marwa's death was so minimal that some news outlets felt compelled to comment on it.
There isn't much coverage of it that we can see so far in the papers, but of course we're covering it here on the BBC.
Yet whilst the BBC and CNN did produce limited reports, they were the exception rather than the rule. The avalanche of coverage that accompanied Neda's death was in large part due to the Western media sharing her cause, but there is also a wider context to Marwa's story.
Neda Sultan was made into the symbol of the Iranian atrocities and the crimes perpetrated by the Iranian regime against its own people.
In her death, this young woman became the emblem of the Iranian opposition movement.
Marwa's death, on the other hand, was blamed on a deranged outcast, a lone wolf.
Eindeutig ausländerfeindlicher Akt eines Fanatikers.
It did not reflect the attitude of the German government or people.
For the Western media, Marwa's murder registered very low on the news agenda, if at all. But on the streets of the Muslim world, from Cairo to Tehran, Marwa's death sparked a wildfire of emotion which their media could not ignore.
The contrast between the way in which the European media dealt with it as compared with the Arab media really brings out the way in which the European media didn't really fully capture what was so horrific about this particular murder, both on an individual level and for German society.
Marwa al-Sharbini was immediately referred to by many Arab television stations, the martyr of the hijab. The case has sparked anger in the Arab world and Egypt for its perceived underreporting in the Western media.
Why doesn't the media suddenly take up an issue? Why do they not pick up something that is absolutely huge?
But what does this lack of depth in the sporadic coverage of Marwa's death compared to that of Neda's say about the state of independent media in the Western world and in Europe in particular, especially when it comes to representing their ethnic minorities?
The media has an absolutely critical role in challenging prejudice and making sure that it breaks down forms of racism, and in this case, in responsibly reporting what has been one of the most horrific hate crimes as far as holding political leaders in European states to account for the way in which these states treat their Muslim minorities. I think the European media is failing quite catastrophically.
But as with so many news stories, there are complex factors that contribute to whether they make it to air, or, as in the case of Marwa's death, hardly get any airtime at all.
In the Neda case, I think that some of the lack of clarity about the facts meant that those in the media who had decisions about how to represent the case had a lot more discretion about how they were going to use the story to promote certain agendas.
On the flip side, Iranian television stations took the murder of Marwa and ran with it, relentlessly exploiting the theme of Islamophobia in Europe, perhaps as a revenge for all the negative publicity the Iranian regime received for the murder of Neda Sultan.
But the question is, if the shoe is on the other foot and a white Christian woman had been stabbed to death, would the silence be so deafening?
2 young women, 2 brutal murders, and 2 news stories where reporters stop being reporters and become activists.